They said it was only a book, a relic bound in leather, inked in Latin, and locked away for centuries. But the first man who opened it never finished the first page. The second was found kneeling, eyes burned white, mouth frozen in prayer. No church claimed it, no priest blessed it, and those who touched it never touched anything again. The monastery was quiet. The night the fire began, the air outside was still, the hills surrounding it cloaked in winter fog, the stone walls glistening with frost. Inside, only the slow rhythm of prayer and the faint smell of tallow candles gave life to the halls. The fire did not start with a roar. It began with smoke, thin gray, seeping through cracks in the cellar floor. The monks noticed it during their evening hymn, voices pausing when a strange heat rippled through the stones beneath their sandals. They rushed down with buckets of water, voices breaking the silence of the cloister. The cellar doors groaned as they opened, releasing a blast of smoke that rolled out like breath from a furnace. Inside they found shelves of parchment, dry wood, old relics collected over centuries, already burning. Flames curled through manuscripts that had not been touched in decades. Icons blackened and fell. The men worked quickly, pouring water, smothering flames, dragging boxes of relics to safety. And in that chaos, one of them noticed something. A shape, half buried beneath charred beams, shielded by stone on three sides. It did not burn. When they pulled it free, it was heavy, heavier than any scripture they had carried. The leather cover was blackened, as though scorched, long before the fire had touched it. Its edges glimmered faintly, dusted with ash that seemed to cling no matter how they brushed it away. The fire around it hissed and died as though retreating. The monks carried it upstairs into the refectory, laying it on a wooden table, their faces, still marked with smoke, bent low over the strange book. The fire was contained, the cellar was ruined, but the thing they had found was intact. They realized then it was a Bible, bound in black, pages darker than parchment, rough like soot. No one spoke at first, they only listened, and in that silence, a strange heaviness pressed down on them, as though the book itself was weighted with more than paper and leather. The youngest monk tried to lift it again, but faltered. His arms trembled, not from exhaustion, but from something colder. He whispered it felt like stone. Another monk pressed his palm against its cover. He pulled away instantly. His skin was red, not from heat, but from something that felt deeper, like the surface of his hand had been drained of warmth. The abbot arrived soon after, summoned from his cell. He entered the room and found his brothers gathered around the table, eyes lowered, breaths shallow. The abbot was old, his beard gray, his face lined with years of prayer. He stepped forward slowly and placed both hands on the table, leaning close to the object. His gaze lingered on the scorched edges, the faint smell of smoke rising from it. He asked who had carried it. The men looked at each other, none willing to speak. At last the youngest monk raised his hand. The abbot studied him, then looked back at the book. He told them not to touch it again. That night, the book remained on the table. The monks tried to return to their prayers, but their voices faltered. Their eyes drifted toward the refectory door. One by one, they confessed they could not sleep. The monastery was never truly silent. There were always footsteps, always whispers of prayer, always the sound of wind moving through the cloister. But that night, silence seemed heavier. The air pressed in on them. The halls felt longer, the stones colder. Some swore they heard the sound of pages turning. The abbot returned to the refectory at midnight. He lit a single candle and sat before the book. His hands trembled as he opened the cover. The pages inside were unlike any he had ever seen. Not parchment, not vellum, something darker. They seemed to absorb the candlelight, drinking it into their fibers. The text was Latin, but not as he knew it. The words twisted, some letters written backwards, others stacked as if hiding something beneath. He read only a few lines before closing it. The next morning, his face was pale. He told the brothers they must not attempt to read it. He would keep it locked away. The cellar had burned, relics were lost, manuscripts turned to ash, yet this Bible had endured, untouched by flame. But something wasn't right. The abbot's hands shook when he carried it to his chamber. The lock on his chest was drawn, and yet the monks noticed. He never set the key down. He kept it on his belt at all times, even when he knelt in prayer. Days passed. The monastery should have returned to rhythm. Prayers at dawn, meals in silence, work in the gardens, chants in the chapel, yet every sound seemed thinner. The brothers found themselves distracted, eyes drifting toward the abbot's door. The youngest monk, the one who had carried it from the fire, confessed in whispers that he dreamed of the book. He said he felt its weight still in his arms at night. Inshorted in Aurelio, inshorted etern. He woke with his chest tight, as though pressed beneath stone. Another monk claimed he saw the abbot awake at impossible hours, candlelight flickering beneath his door. He heard murmuring, low, rhythmic, almost like chanting, but the words were wrong, twisted, curling in on themselves. The abbot denied it. He said his prayers were the same as theirs, yet his eyes grew darker each day, his skin pale as if drained. The cellar was rebuilt slowly, charred beams carried out, rubble cleared, stone reset, but none of the men wanted to work near the spot where the book had been found. They said the stones there were colder, even under sun. Their fingers stiffened when they touched them. One morning, as the monks entered the chapel, they noticed ash scattered across the altar. The abbot was already inside, kneeling, the Bible open before him. He turned as they entered, and shut it quickly. His voice was calm, but his eyes would not meet theirs. At meals, his hands trembled as he lifted bread to his lips. He no longer blessed the table. He ate in silence. The monks whispered among themselves. Some said the book was cursed. Others said it was a test of faith. One even suggested it was a relic sent by God, preserved through fire, as proof of his will. But none of them truly believed their own words. The nights grew longer. The fog around the monastery thickened. The bells, which had always rung with clarity, began to sound muffled, as though the air itself resisted their echo. And in the stillness of those nights, some swore they heard it again, the faint sound of pages turning. One monk, older than the rest, decided he must see for himself. He crept into the abbot's chamber while the others slept. The candle on the abbot's desk had burned low. The Bible lay closed, bound shut with a leather strap. The monk reached for it. His fingers brushed the cover, and he froze. He felt something move beneath it. Not the shifting of pages, not the settling of leather, but something alive, pressing upward, meeting his hand. He pulled away instantly. His skin tingled cold and hot at once, as though the surface of his palm had been branded. He staggered back, overturning a stool. The abbot woke, his eyes snapped open, wild, his breath ragged. He rose quickly, clutching the book to his chest, his voice low and harsh. He demanded the monk leave. The next morning, the abbot told the brothers that the man had left the monastery. No explanation, no farewell, simply gone. But his sandals remained by his bed. His robe still hung in his cell. His tools lay on the bench where he had left them. The monks did not ask again. The abbot locked himself away. After that, he no longer joined them in prayer. He no longer ate with them in silence. His candle burned at all hours, light leaking from beneath the door, shadows stretching across the hall, and the monks began to notice something else. The book was heavier now. They had not touched it, had not lifted it since the fire, but they knew. The chest that held it bowed under its weight.
The stone shelf beneath seemed to strain. When the abbot carried it, his shoulders bent lower, his arms trembling, as though burdened by more than paper. The brothers avoided his gaze. They avoided the chamber, and yet each of them dreamed of it. They woke in the night with the taste of ash on their tongues, their fingers blackened as if with soot, though no fire had burned. Some whispered words in their sleep, Latin words, but twisted, broken, rearranged. The monastery changed. Meals went uneaten, chants faltered, the gardens grew wild. Dust gathered in corners that had always been kept clean, and always from behind the abbot's door, the low sound of murmuring, words too soft to understand, but words nonetheless. The youngest monk, the one who had first carried it, could no longer bear it. He confessed he felt as though the book still rested in his arms, crushing him. He begged the abbot to destroy it. The abbot's face darkened, his eyes hollow, his voice cold. He said it could not be destroyed, that it had already survived fire, that it was meant to remain. The boy pressed him. Why keep it here? Why guard it? The abbot's lips trembled as he answered, because it was not us who found it. It was it that let itself be found. The boy said nothing more. He turned and left. That night, the abbot locked his chamber. He placed the key beneath his pillow, and the monks, restless, awake in their cells, listened. The sound of pages turning filled the halls. The candlelight trembled against the stone walls. The room was small, narrow, lined with shelves that held fragments of scripture, scraps of commentary, and a scattering of books borrowed from distant abbeys. The wax bled slowly down the sides of the taper, dripping onto the wooden desk, where a young scholar leaned forward, pen in hand, eyes fixed on the open pages before him. The Bible lay heavy in the center of the table. Its leather was black, its edges charred, its pages darker than any he had ever seen.
Begged the abbot for the chance to study it. He claimed he could identify its hand, trace its script, perhaps even restore its meaning. The abbot hesitated, but at last allowed him one night, only one. The young man believed he had been given a chance to prove himself. He believed he was ready, but something wasn't right. The first page did not meet his expectations. The letters were Latin, yes, but twisted. The angles bent too sharply, loops stretched too long, words stacked unevenly, as though written in haste or in secrecy. Some letters were inverted, mirrored as though reflected in glass. Others seemed to bleed into one another, curling into shapes not found in any manuscript he had ever studied. Still, he pressed forward. He whispered the words under his breath, carefully at first, his finger tracing each line. His voice was soft, steady, deliberate, but as the candlelight flickered, the letters seemed to shift. A loop became a hook, a crossbar disappeared. The single word swelled into two, then three. He frowned, leaned closer, rubbed at his eyes. When he spoke again, the sounds that left his lips were not the same as those on the page. They were sharper, thicker, curling into tones that seemed to scratch against the air. He paused, startled by the sound of his own voice. He glanced behind him, half expecting to find someone there, but the room was empty. Only the candle, only the shadows, only the faint drip of wax against the wood. He told himself it was nothing, that he was tired, that the letters were strange, and his tongue had stumbled. He dipped his pen in ink, trying to copy the words onto a fresh sheet. His hand moved quickly, scratching lines across the parchment, but when he lifted his eyes again, the word he had just written was gone, vanished. Only a black smear of ink remained, spreading across the page like a stain. The scholar's heart quickened. He tried again. This time, he whispered slower, sounding out each syllable, refusing to let his voice wander. The sound came thick, unnatural, but he forced it into shape. His pen scratched again. The letters formed clearly this time. He exhaled, relieved. Then the letters shifted before his eyes. They bent, they curled, They became something else, and that's when he heard it. A whisper, faint behind him. Not Latin, not any language he knew. He froze. His pen dropped from his hand. The candle sputtered. The room seemed colder. He turned slowly, expecting to see someone in the shadows, but there was nothing, only stone, shelves, silence. He reached for the Bible again. His hand trembled as he turned the page. The next passage was worse. The letters no longer looked like Latin at all. They were symbols now, tangled, angular, pressing against each other like a wall of thorns. He traced them with his finger, trying to make sense of the order, the rhythm. His lips parted, and without thinking, he spoke them. The sound that left his mouth was wrong. It did not belong to him. It was too deep, too slow, dragging like gravel across stone. His chest tightened, his throat burned. He coughed, tried to stop, but the words kept spilling out. They tumbled from him, like water from a broken jar, pouring into the candlelit air. Thick and heavy, the scholar clutched his throat. His eyes watered, his knees pressed into the stone floor. As he bent forward, the Bible still open before him. His hand smudged the ink, leaving dark streaks across the page, but he could not stop reading. The words dragged themselves out of him, line after line, sentence after sentence. He tried to rise, but his legs trembled. His fingers dug into the altar, leaving black stains across the wood. The candle sputtered harder, as though struggling for air, and then just as suddenly, it stopped. His voice cut off. The silence pressed down again. He collapsed forward, chest heaving, face pale. His hands shook as he clutched the edge of the desk, pulling himself up. His lips were cracked, bleeding faintly, ink smeared across his chin. The Bible lay open before him, its pages untouched. Not a single mark of his struggle was left behind. He staggered to his feet, backing away, eyes fixed on the black leather, the scorched edges. His chest rose and fell sharply. His breath echoed in the tiny chamber, but the book was still, closed, silent. He pressed his back against the wall, sliding down until he sat on the cold stone. His hands were black with ink, but he had not dipped his pen. His fingernails were dark, his fingertips stained. He rubbed at them furiously, but the blackness clung. His eyes grew heavy, his head tipped forward. Exhaustion washed over him like a tide. By morning, the chamber was silent. The candle had burned itself to the end. Wax pooled on the desk. The chair was empty. The door was ajar, and on the altar, the Bible lay open, its pages spread wide. The young scholar was gone. All that remained were fingerprints, black pressed into the wood, 10 of them, clear and sharp, ink-stained marks where his hands had clutched the altar in the dark. No one ever saw him again, and no one touched those prints. They remained, even when the wood was scrubbed, even when new wax was poured, even when the altar itself was replaced. The fingerprints did not fade. The camera drifts down a long stone corridor. The air is damp. The walls breathe with condensation, slick to the touch. The candles, half burnt, lean in their sconces. Wax drips like veins against the stone. The monastery has fallen quiet, but not silent, because when the brothers move through these halls, their footsteps carry the sound of prayer, whispered, unfamiliar, as though someone has been speaking just a few steps ahead, yet no one is there. The first to notice was Brother Adrian. He was a man of order, a man who carried his duties with a steady rhythm, sweeping the nave each morning, lighting the lamps at dusk. He did not believe in interruptions, and yet one night, as he moved between pews with a broom in his hand, he froze, because he heard it. Low, murmured, a voice that seemed to be lodged between the stones themselves. He thought at first it was another brother in prayer, but when he turned the corner, he found the chapel empty, but not still. The voice continued. It came from the altar. He leaned closer and realized it wasn't Latin, nor any tongue he had studied, but the cadence was familiar, a rhythm that matched the Mass, like syllables caught in an echo. But there was no echo, and no one to create it. Adrian's broom slipped from his hands. The bristles struck the floor with a hollow snap. The prayer stopped, and the chapel was drowned in silence. He left that night without finishing his duties, but he never told the others what he'd heard. The second was Brother Matthias. He was younger, restless, a scholar, more at home among manuscripts than candles. His nights were long, spent poring over fragments of Greek, of Hebrew, of Aramaic. One evening, when the storm pressed hard against the windows, he heard the same thing. The voice, soft, continuous. It rose from the nave below his study. At first he thought the brothers had begun a vigil without him, but when he descended the stair, the lamps had not been lit. The pews were deserted, and yet the sound remained. It wove between the arches like smoke. Matthias stood at the threshold. He listened. The syllables twisted against his ear. They were not words he recognized, but patterns that resembled them. A tongue that wanted to be known, but refused. He said nothing to the others, but when he returned to his cell he wrote the sounds he remembered, letter by letter, shape by shape. In the morning, the page was blank. Only faint pressure remained, as though the ink had never truly touched the parchment. And when he pressed his palm against it, his fingers came away darkened with soot. The third was Brother Elias. He was not a man of books. He was a man of fields, of dirt beneath his nails, of crops that bent heavy in the summer. He was not given to fear, but one morning, before dawn, when he entered the church to prepare the lamps, he found himself pausing at the door, because he heard them all at once. Not one voice, but many, layered, twisting, as though a full congregation knelt before the altar. Their cadence rose and fell with the rhythm of worship, but no pew was occupied, no lips moved. The prayers seemed to seep from the very air. Elias dared not step inside. He stood at the threshold, the lamp shaking in his hands, and he listened for a full minute, until he thought he recognized his own name, whispered, folded into the prayer. That was when he turned and fled into the courtyard. The sound followed him until he crossed beneath the cloister. Only then did it stop. The brothers began to whisper of it among themselves. At first they tried to dismiss it. Wind through the cracks, the settling of stone. But deep down, they knew the sound had begun. When the book was brought up from the cellar, and when night fell, none dared walk the halls alone. Still, the voices continued, always near the altar, always when no one prayed. The abbot forbade discussion. He demanded silence. "It is not for us to imagine," he said. "It is only for us to serve." But service faltered. Meals were missed. Duties left unfinished. Candles burned to their roots without being replaced. And the shadows grew longer. Because when a man begins to doubt his own ears, he begins to doubt everything. Brother Adrian stopped sweeping the nave. Brother Matthias stopped writing. Brother Elias stopped lighting lamps. Each feared the moment they would hear their name again. But something wasn't right. The voices were changing. What began as murmurs grew clearer. Not words, but syllables stretched thin, like a chant drawn too long. And sometimes it wasn't just one voice. It was two, answering each other. A call, and a reply. The sound seeped through the monastery, pressing into the cells where the brothers tried to sleep. Adrian woke one night, with the echo in his chest, as though his heart had been beating to its rhythm. Matthias dreamed of it.
pages fluttering with syllables he could not pin down. Elias began to wake before dawn, listening, waiting, fearing. The voices might call to him again. They tried to pray louder. They tried to sing the psalms as they once had, steady and strong. But the new rhythm overtook their own. Their voices faltered. They lost their place until they sat in silence, listening. And that's when they realized the voices did not need them. The prayers continued, whether the brothers spoke or not. The cadence never broke, even when the chapel was empty, even when every lamp had gone out. The abbot remained silent. He never acknowledged it. But they noticed how his hands trembled when he placed the book upon the altar, how his lips moved when no words were spoken, how his gaze lingered on the pages as though listening. They wondered if he too had heard his name. And they wondered what would happen when the prayers were finally understood, because the voices were growing clearer and closer, and they would not stop.
The river moved slowly beneath the dawn. Its surface was dark, broken only by the faint ripples of reeds bending in the current. Mist clung low to the water, rolling across the banks, swallowing the outlines of the trees. The villagers stood at a distance, their boots sunk in damp earth, their eyes narrowed against the pale light. Something had been found. They had not expected it. They had searched the fields, the barns, the paths that cut through the hills. They had called his name until their voices grew hoarse, but it was the river that answered. A shape drifted near the reeds, heavy, caught against the roots. At first, it looked like wood, a log, blackened by rain, but when the fog shifted, they saw the curve of a shoulder, the bend of a knee, the pale, rigid shape of a man. He was folded in half, not bound, not broken, but bent as though knelt in prayer, his legs pressed beneath him, arms tucked close, head bowed forward against his chest. The current had not undone him. The water had not scattered him. He remained locked in devotion, and his mouth was open. The men waded in, their hands trembling as they pulled the body to shore. His skin was cold, his clothes torn, but what clung to their palms was not water. It was ash. From his lips spilled gray powder, fine and dry, coating their fingers, staining the grass. One man coughed as the dust lifted into the air. Another stepped back, his boots sinking deep into the mud, his face pale with fear. They called for the priest. He came slowly, robes gathered at his waist, his eyes lowered to the ground. He did not hurry, he did not kneel. He only looked at the body, his face drawn tight, his hands locked around the crucifix at his chest. The villagers waited. They wanted words, they wanted explanation, they wanted comfort, but he said nothing. He crossed himself, he turned, he walked back toward the monastery, the mist closing around him. The men stood by the riverbank, uncertain, the body at their feet, the ash drifting in the air. No one spoke, no one dared. It was the silence that spread first, the silence of the priest, the silence of the monastery, the silence of the river, and with that silence came fear, because this was not just a death, this was a theft. Everyone knew what he had carried from the monastery gates that night. They had seen the black bundle pressed against his chest, the way he slipped through the shadows, whispering to himself as though bargaining with God. They knew what it was. The book, the one the priests never spoke of, the one no villager was permitted to see. And now he was gone, the book with him. But when his body surfaced, there was no sign of it, not in his arms, not in the river, not on the bank. Vanished. The villagers buried him quietly. No procession, no ringing of bells, no sermon, only the scrape of shovels against earth, the thud of soil striking the coffin lid. His wife wept, his children clung to her skirts, The others stood back, their faces drawn, their whispers low. The priest presided, but he did not speak. He made the sign of the cross, his eyes fixed on the ground, and left before the last stone was laid. It was not right. There should have been prayers. There should have been absolution. There should have been a farewell. But instead, there was only silence. And silence is heavier than death. At night, the villagers whispered. They told stories in their kitchens. Voices hushed so children would not hear. They spoke of the body folded like prayer, of the ash that filled his lungs, of the missing book, and then, of the voices, because some claimed they heard them. When the wind cut across the fields, when the night pressed too close, they swore they could hear prayers drifting on the air. Not Latin, not words they knew, but something like chanting, a rhythm, a cadence, echoing from the chapel. Others said it was the river, that if you stood by the reeds where the body was found, you could hear murmurs rising from the water, bubbling through the mist. One woman woke her husband in the night, swearing she heard someone outside their door, whispering a prayer she could not understand. He found nothing, only footprints in the dirt, ash smeared across the threshold. Children cried in their beds saying they heard singing through the walls. Men tossed in their sleep, muttering words not their own. The village grew restless. They asked the priests for answers. The priests gave none. They asked what the book contained, what curse had passed into their homes. The priests only prayed louder, their doors barred, their lamps burning deep into the night. And that was when suspicion grew. Because the priests were not afraid, they were hiding something. The villagers began to watch. They lingered near the monastery walls, listening. They saw shadows moving late into the night, candles flickering through narrow windows. They heard low voices, rising and falling in unison, like mass spoken behind closed doors. But the chapel was empty. When morning came, the brothers swore they had prayed alone, that the villagers were mistaken, that nothing had been heard. The villagers did not believe them. They remembered the body, the folded limbs, the open mouth, the ash that clung to their hands, and they knew something had been carried from the monastery that night, something that did not belong to them, something that would not return. The river was not silent anymore. Its water ran dark, carrying whispers downstream. Cattle would not drink from it. Fishermen found nets torn, catches spoiled. Children avoided the bank, claiming the reeds moved even when the wind was still. A farmer's wife went to draw water and returned pale. Her bucket spilled across the ground. She swore she saw a face beneath the surface, not her husband's, not her neighbor's, a face she did not know. Eyes open, mouth moving, speaking words she could not hear. By the seventh night, the village was breaking. Fires burned in the hearths, but no one felt warmth. Men sharpened tools but did not work the fields. Women prayed, but could not finish their words. Children were kept inside, shutters barred, candles lit through the dark, and the monastery remained silent. Its bells did not ring, its doors did not open, its priests did not speak. The villagers began to gather in secret. They lit lanterns and met in barns, whispering of what should be done. Some said the priests had cursed them, others said the thief had carried damnation into their homes. A few argued that the book had not been lost at all, that it was still here, hidden, waiting. And then came the rumor that the priest himself had seen the man take it, that he had let him go, that he had wanted the theft. No one knew if it was true, but the rumor spread, curling through the streets like smoke. And when men spread rumor, it becomes belief. The village no longer feared the river. They feared the silence of the priests. And silence, like ash, does not wash away.
The halls of the monastery stood quiet, beneath the weight of their own stone. The cloister arches stretched long and cold, swallowing footsteps, swallowing voices, leaving only the sound of air that never seemed to move. At first glance, it appeared unchanged. Candles burned, though their flames leaned strangely, as though disturbed by something unseen. The corridors smelled of wax and incense, but behind it lingered another scent, dry parchment, singed around the edges. It was into this silence that the officials came. They were not monks, not locals, not men familiar with the cold rhythm of the cloister. They carried themselves differently, boots striking too loud against the worn stone floors, shoulders wrapped in traveling cloaks too heavy for the season, eyes set with the practiced sternness of men sent not to witness, but to contain. They asked no questions. They did not linger on the faces of the brothers who watched them from shadowed doorways. They came only for the book. The order had been sent from above. Rome had heard of it. Rome had judged. Rome had called it false, and in one motion, without ever looking upon its pages, the decree was handed down. Forgery, deception, danger to the faithful. But something wasn't right. The book lay inside a simple wooden chest, iron-banded, placed upon the altar as if it were a relic. When the clerks opened it, the hinges groaned too loud for their size, and the lid trembled as though reluctant to rise. Inside, the Bible appeared, ordinary. No gold, no jeweled clasp, just leather cracked with age, spine heavy with use, pages yellowed, edges darkened by fingertips long vanished. Yet when one of the men reached to lift it, his hand stalled. Witnesses would later claim it was the silence that stopped him, the sudden absence of his own breath, the absence of the sound of feet shifting on stone, the absence of his own heartbeat. And then he touched it. The Bible slid against his palm like something alive. A twitch ran through his hand, sharp, electric. He gasped, then quickly covered it with a laugh too brittle to carry conviction. He lifted it from the chest, leather creaking faintly under his grip. He held it up to prove his strength, but his lips were already beginning to crack. The others didn't notice at first, only a tightening of skin, a faint dryness, as though he had walked all day in desert air. But when he swallowed, the sound was raw, unnatural. When he tried to speak, no voice came, and that's when he heard it. The sound of hymns, not sung by the monks who lingered nervously at the far end of the cloister, not muttered by the officials who stood beside him, but inside his head, close, pressed against his ear, as though whispered by someone kneeling behind him. The cadence was unmistakable, the rhythm of liturgy, the rise and fall of prayer, but not in Latin, not in any tongue known to him. A language that turned his stomach even as it tightened his grip on the book. He collapsed within the hour, body convulsing, eyes rolled white, mouth open in a desperate attempt at air. But no air entered. Instead, those who leaned over him recoiled. Ash, not water, not spittle, but ash poured faintly from his lips, dusting his chin, streaking his collar.
His lungs had filled with it. The sound of his choking was the sound of pages turning in a fire. The book was pried from his hands, but only with difficulty. The fingers had locked so tightly, it took the strength of 3 men to peel them back, one by one. They tried not to meet each other's eyes. They tried not to speak of what they had seen, but every man there felt the same sickness rising at the base of his throat. This was no forgery, and yet it was no ordinary scripture either. Still, the order from Rome was final. The decree was not to be questioned, so the clerks wrote their reports with hands that trembled slightly against the parchment. The book was sealed again in its chest, bound with new iron, carried under guard, and the monastery was closed, doors locked, windows barred, Brothers dispersed to other houses, or sent home to villages they no longer remembered how to live in. Some wept as they packed their few belongings. Some remained silent, faces pale, lips pressed too tightly shut. And though the officials never spoke of it, though Rome denied it had ever passed through their hands, the whispers spread, because every man who touched the book, even briefly, changed. A scribe assigned to carry it 3 days' journey was later found collapsed in his chamber, body rigid, lips cracked, whispering soundless words, even in death. A clerk who copied the false decree fell silent mid-sentence, his pen dragging black across the page as he convulsed. And another, who never touched the book, but only brushed the edge of the chest as it passed, was discovered one morning in the chapel, standing stiff before the altar, mouth frozen open, ash on his tongue. Yet the records said nothing. Rome denied everything. The monastery was erased from letters, removed from maps, forgotten in official speech. But the villagers remembered. They spoke in hushed tones of the men who arrived with cloaks too heavy, with eyes too cold. They remembered the sound of their boots, the echo in the stone halls, the sight of their faces when the first clerk fell. And they remembered the silence afterward, when the cloister bell rang no more, when the chapel doors were chained, when the prayers ceased, the denial was written. But the memory was not erased, for though Rome buried the truth, though the officials burned their papers, though the monastery was closed, sealed, abandoned, those who had been inside, even once, carried the sound with them, the sound of hymns, in languages no priest could name, in cadences no ear could forget, and it never left them, not in waking, not in sleep, not in prayer. The voices followed, low, insistent, unyielding, until the day each man collapsed, and ash took his breath. The camera drifts across a dim study, shelves lean beneath the weight of books, spines cracked, corners bent from use. The window is half shuttered, glass smudged by the damp breath of the city outside. Inside the air is close, thick with dust, thick with something else, ink drying on paper, not meant to be read by anyone else. It is here, in this narrow room, that the scholar worked, alone, late into the night. At first he treated the Bible as artifact, an object to be catalogued, studied, measured against the long memory of texts. He approached it with the same precision he gave to any fragment of scripture, dates, margins, annotations, the routine comfort of scholarship. But something wasn't right. The first journal begins calmly. His handwriting is steady, even, neatly aligned to the ruled paper. He describes the leather binding, its peculiar dryness, as though it had resisted oil and touch for centuries. He notes the ink, faded, yet not, black that still clings with a strange sheen, even in low light. He describes phrases that appear familiar, only to break apart upon closer reading. A sound that begins with words recognizable, before bending towards syllables no tongue could form. A blessing that loops back into itself, line after line, until the rhythm becomes suffocating. He notes it all, methodically, like a man keeping distance. But by the second week, his notes shift, the handwriting loosens, slopes harder to the right, sentences fracture, pauses grow longer. He begins to remark not on the text, but on the sound of it. When read aloud, he writes, the words resist, they reshape themselves. A phrase that begins in Hebrew, ends in something else entirely, though his lips form it without his will. He records phonetic scraps in the margins, odd clusters of consonants, unfamiliar vowels. He underlines them once, twice, and then he stops trying, because the words change. What he copies one night is not the same in the morning. Whole phrases alter when his eyes return. What was prayer becomes command. What was blessing becomes curse. And that's when he heard it.
the sound of pages turning, not by his hand, not by any draught of air, but in the stillness of the room, in the hours when no candle burned, and the house had settled into silence. The faint shift of parchment against parchment, slow, deliberate, turning. The third journal is stained, not with water, not with wax, but with ink, spilled not from the bottle, but from the page itself. He writes that the letters move, that when his fingers brush the margin, the ink clings to his skin, not smudged, not streaked, clings, like something alive. It does not wash away with water, not with lye. He wears gloves afterward, but the stains creep higher, darkening the web of his fingers, seeping beneath his nails. He hides this, even as he continues to write, even as he feels his own pulse faltering in rhythm. With the words he copies, the entries thin out. Days pass without notation, then weeks, and when he does return, his language is unsteady. Lines repeat, whole passages loop across pages, a prayer he swore he did not know, written over and over in a hand less and less his own. Neighbors remember the sounds, a voice whispering long after midnight, carrying through the thin glass of his study window. Not chanting, not song, but prayer, rising, falling, endless. They say he spoke it as though answering something unseen, and when he paused, when the silence broke, they swore they heard another voice, faint, low, from within the walls. The last journal is the smallest, half its pages torn out, the ink darker than before, as if pressed harder, deeper, desperate to hold against time. The entries stumble, short, broken, more margin than text. He writes that the book no longer rests where he leaves it, that he sets it upon the desk and finds it later on the floor, that the pages open themselves, that his hands wake to find it waiting, splayed before him, without memory of how it came there. His final entry begins mid-sentence, no date, no closure, just the sharp mark of a pen dragged fast, then nothing. The page ends there, blank. His body was never recovered, only the journals remain, hidden in the walls of his study, discovered decades later by workmen who swore they heard whispering in the plaster as they tore it down. And though the notes are preserved now, locked away in an archive, something lingers, because the stains never faded. The ink on those pages still glistens faintly under light, and those who read too long say the letters shift, that the words breathe, that sometimes when the room falls quiet enough, they hear the pages turn. The morning of the burning began long before the sun reached the hills. The air was damp, heavy, the kind that clung to skin and made even breath feel like weight. Mist slid across the cobblestones, veiling the square in a pale shroud. Windows cracked open, shutters leaning outward as faces peered into the gray. There was no bell that called to prayer. There was only the sound of boots against stone. The townspeople gathered silently, their shapes forming a dark outline against the fog. Mothers pulled shawls around their children. Men pressed their hands against their caps. No one spoke loudly. Every word was hushed, swallowed before it carried, because everyone knew what had been promised. At the center of the square, the pyre had already been built. It rose high, a frame of timber soaked with pitch, bundles of straw knotted between the beams. The smell of tar hung sharp in the air, bitter and unnatural, and bound upon it, tied tight with rope, sat the Bible. The black Bible, its cover scarred and rigid, its pages closed like lips refusing to part. Even from a distance, it looked heavier than it should have been, like the wood bent beneath its weight. The priests circled it in silence, their robes dragged over damp stone, their torches still unlit. Their eyes were fixed forward, yet none of them seemed willing to meet the other's gaze. Their mouths moved faintly, as though muttering prayers beneath the breath, but their voices did not rise, not yet, and the crowd waited. The fire was meant to be a final act, a demonstration, proof that this book, this object of whispers and fear, was nothing more than superstition. That fire would reduce it to what it was claimed to be: wood pulp, leather, and ink, ash to be scattered, nothing more. But something wasn't right. The torches were lit at last. The flames sputtered in the damp, bending low, as though reluctant. One by one, the priests approached the pyre. The ropes groaned as the heat licked at them. Straw caught, snapping with sudden brightness. The beams hissed as tar bled smoke into the air. The crowd stepped back. Hands rose to shield faces from the heat. Children cried into the folds of their mothers' dresses. The square glowed red, shadows leaping against the walls of stone. And yet in the heart of it, where the Bible lay, there was no change. The fire climbed, it devoured the beams. It raced up the altar frame. Robes curled, blackened, vanished. But the book did not blacken. It did not char. It sat motionless, as if the flames had bent around it. A man in the crowd muttered, "Too loud. Why doesn't it burn?" The words rippled outward, catching on every ear. Murmurs rose, shuffling through the press of bodies. Fear cracked the silence, and that's when he heard it. A sound beneath the fire. Not the roar of pitch, not the pop of splitting beams. A low rhythm, like breath, like something inhaling. The fire bent inward. Sparks swirled not up, but down, sucked toward the book. The smoke no longer drifted into the sky.
It funneled, curling tightly, drawn into the closed seam of its pages. The more the fire raged, the darker the book became, as though varnished by the very smoke that should have consumed it. The priests faltered. One raised his hand, his lips cracking in frantic prayer. Another clutched the frame of the pyre, eyes watering from the smoke, but would not step closer. A third dropped his torch and stumbled back, his face ashen, whispering, "It breathes." The crowd surged. Some pressed forward, morbid with disbelief. Others dragged their children back through the press, desperate to escape the suffocating heat. Every breath tasted of ash. It coated the tongue, thick and acrid, yet the fire gave no warmth. The air grew colder, sharper, biting against the skin. The altar groaned. Timbers collapsed inward, falling in showers of sparks. The priests shouted over the roar, but their words faltered, broken into gasps. One fell to the ground, convulsing, his mouth opening and closing in silence, his tongue blackened as if he had swallowed soot. Another tore his robe free as fire caught the hem, staggering through the crowd without a cry for help. The rest could only stare, because the book remained, unburned, unchanged, unmoving, and beneath the crackle of the fire, the sound was clearer now, a cadence, like a prayer spoken far away, not Latin, not Greek, not any tongue the priests had studied, but steady, measured, as if the Mass continued without them. The fire collapsed at last. The straw was ash, the beams were cinders, the ropes had long since vanished, the altar itself nothing but glowing fragments. But there, among the embers, lay the Bible, whole cold, waiting. The silence that followed was worse than the fire. No one moved, no one spoke. The smoke still hung thick, refusing to drift, but there was no sound now, except the uneven rasp of human breath, and from the center pages shifting, faint as a sigh. The crowd broke. Some fled outright, shoving past one another into narrow streets. Others stood paralyzed, their eyes fixed on the blackened square, their hands trembling as though in prayer. The priests did not stop them. They did not speak. They stood in the circle of ash, their faces pale, their lips cracked, their eyes wide with something beyond disbelief. That night, no one slept. The houses closest to the square reeked of smoke, though every window had been thrown open. The families inside whispered of air too thin, of walls that seemed to pulse, of dreams filled with fire that would not consume. And some swore they still heard it, the faint rhythm, the echo of a prayer, carried through the streets long after the embers died. By morning,
The priests had carried the Bible away. No one saw where. The square was swept clean, the ash scattered, the pyre erased, but the smell lingered, and the fear lingered more, because everyone who stood there knew what they had seen. Fire that could consume wood, rope, cloth, and flesh, but not that book. It had not been destroyed, it had only been fed, and in the silence of the town that followed, the question pressed heavier than the smoke had. What had they woken when they tried to burn it? The answer never came, but the nights grew longer, and in the dark, some swore they saw it still, a faint outline, sitting whole in the center of the square, breathing, waiting to be opened again. The cell where he was kept was small, stone walls slick with damp, a single barred window set high, where light rarely reached, and in the center, upon a table of iron, lay the book, the Black Bible, unburned, untouched by fire. A young priest was assigned to it, his name recorded in church ledgers, though the handwriting grew faint, as if ink itself resisted the record. He was told his duty was simple: keep watch, pray, do not open it. For a time he did. Each morning, he knelt. Each evening, he whispered the litany passed down through centuries. He ate with the others, though less than most. He slept little, but the discipline was familiar. It was what priests were meant to do, yet something wasn't right. He began to refuse meals. First bread, then broth, then water. He said fasting was necessary, that a voice had called to him, not from the walls, not from the stones, from the book. At first the others dismissed it. Long nights, the weight of fear. It could bend a man's mind. They told him to rest. They told him to eat. They told him to keep distance, but he would not. He sat for hours before it, hands folded, breath shallow. His lips barely moved, yet words slipped out in fragments, unfamiliar passages, scripture spoken in cadences. No one taught him, and at night, they heard him through the walls, the rasp of prayer that did not end, the scrape of knees against stone as he moved closer to the table, the faint thrum, like breath not his own, filling the silence between each phrase. The days stretched, his body thinned, cheeks hollowed, eyes sank deep into shadow, but he did not falter. He claimed he was preparing, that the voice would reveal itself fully, that his body must be emptied to receive it. The others grew uneasy. One priest reported the sound of pages shifting, though the book remained closed. Another claimed to see a faint haze above it, like smoke, but with no fire. The air was heavier in that cell, dense, clinging to skin, and every man who entered came out with a headache that lasted until nightfall. Still, the young priest stayed. Still he listened. Still he fasted. And that's when they found him. It was dawn when the door was opened. Light fell into the cell. The book rested on the table, as before, but the priest no longer knelt. He lay on the floor, his body still, his lips parted in what looked like prayer, though no sound came. His skin was no longer pale. It was black, not charred, not burned, black like ink. From beneath the surface, words had surfaced, lines etched across his chest, phrases curling over his arms, verses winding across his ribs, not written, not carved, but grown from within, as though scripture had forced itself outward through flesh. The others stood in silence. One stepped forward, trembling. He pressed 2 fingers to the man's throat. No pulse, but the skin was warm, and when they looked closer, the words were still moving. Letters shifted, lines rearranged, verses dissolving into others, reforming, rewriting themselves across his body. The priest staggered back, their mouths opened in prayer, but no sound came, because the words were already being spoken, not by them, not aloud, but within the cell itself, as if the book had found a voice. The body was carried away, buried in secret ground, unmarked. The church would not permit his name to be tied to what had happened. The cell was sealed. The book was moved deeper still, beneath stone, behind iron, but the others did not forget. The image lingered, skin turned to scripture, a man consumed not by fire, but by words, and in the quiet hours, they whispered of him, of the way his lips had remained parted, of the way his body had not cooled, of the faint rhythm that echoed in the dark hall, long after he was gone, breathing, waiting, preparing another. The streets of the village lay quiet beneath a sky, the color of iron. Shutters rattled in the wind. A cart overturned in the mud had not been righted. The smell of rot drifted from the market stalls, where fruit blackened and meat swelled with flies. For weeks, families had left in silence, one wagon at a time, rolling down the road at dawn. Not all reached the next town. Those who did rarely spoke of what they had seen, only of what they had heard. The priests still walked the cloister, though their steps had grown unsteady. They spoke less, prayers thinned into whispers, their faces turned gaunt, eyes shifting when asked about the book. Something wasn't right. The church bell once marked the rhythm of the town: morning mass, evening prayer, the turning of the week, the closing of the harvest, the mourning of the dead. But now, the sound of it brought dread. Children cried when it rang. Mothers pressed cloth against their ears. Even the dogs cowered, because sometimes it rang when no one pulled the rope. At first it was denied. Wind, they said, a flaw in the timber. Perhaps a bird had nested there. But the tone was too deliberate, too heavy. A bell struck with the weight of intention, even as the rope swayed untouched in the air. Merchants packed their wares. Fishermen abandoned their nets. Shops stood shuttered. The market square grew hollow. The church insisted order remained, that there was nothing to fear, that leaving only gave power to rumor. But in their own eyes, doubt swam like smoke. And then came the final night. The sky bruised with storm, the valley wrapped in mist. A silence fell deeper than before, so complete that even the crickets stopped. And then the bells began, not one in unison, but many, from steeple to steep, from tower to chapel. Each bell groaned its own note, scattered, broken, colliding against the others, in a dirge that rolled through the valley. No hand pulled them, no rope moved, yet still they tolled. And in the houses below, families froze. Fathers clenched their fists, mothers held children tighter, old men sank to their knees, whispering prayers that cracked in their throats. The sound grew heavier, as if the air itself thickened with iron. Windows trembled, doors shook in their frames, and still the bells did not stop. One man, unable to bear it, staggered into the street. He looked to the tower, its outline split by lightning. The rope swung free in the open air, but the bell above still moved, its mouth opening, closing, opening again, like breath. And that's when he heard it. Not ringing, not echo, but voices. Each toll carried more than sound. Words, whispers folded within the clang of metal. Not in any tongue he knew, but the rhythm was there, like a hymn, like prayer. His knees buckled, his hands clawed at his ears. Yet the sound pressed deeper, not against flesh, but inside his skull. He screamed, but no one heard it over the bells. By dawn, the bells were silent. The valley was not. Doors hung open, bells lay empty, food smoldered on abandoned hearths.
Some fled before the night had ended. Others had vanished without a trace. What remained was silence, not the stillness of peace, but the kind of silence that listens back. The church kept its record. They called it hysteria. They called it flight, born of fear. But those who survived told a different story, that the bells had not told alone, that beneath the clash of iron, there had been voices, and that once you heard them, you could never unhear them. The valley never recovered. The fields grew wild, the stalls crumbled, and the sound of bells was never trusted again, because every now and then, when the wind turned across the ridge, you could still hear it, not in unison, not together, but scattered, broken, like a dirge without end, waiting for another night. The archive hall rests, at the far end of the university, a building of stone and iron, its windows barred, its doors sealed with locks, older than the men who hold the keys. Inside, the air smells of dust and wax. The silence is deep enough to hear the shifting of wood in its beams, the settling of glass in its frames. Students rarely enter, even professors do not linger, because within its heart lies a single object that no one wants to claim. The Black Bible. It does not sit among the shelves. It is not catalogued like the others. It has its own chamber, a case of glass, reinforced with steel, chains crossed over it, padlocked at every hinge, and still, it feels uncontained. The surface of its cover is scorched, blackened as though drawn from a fire that never ended. The edges of its pages curl inward, stiff and brittle, yet untouched by decay. Its presence bends the room around it, shadows lean toward it, light falters near its glass. Researchers note these things in careful language: air pressure, electrostatic charge, the imagination of suggestion. But when they step too close, they grow quiet, because the air changes there. It thickens, it draws down into the lungs, like smoke. Breath feels heavier, as if drawn against resistance. A faint tremor hums at the edge of hearing, never quite a sound, but never silence either. And something wasn't right. Guards rotate often, no one stays on that shift long. They claim the hours near it move strangely. Minutes feel drawn out, stretched to breaking, then collapse in a rush. Some hear a pulse, like a heartbeat. Others hear a low drone, rising from within the glass. And once, only once, one man swore it spoke. Not words, not sentences, but a vibration in the air, pressing against his chest, forming syllables that vanished before they could be known. He refused to return. But the church denies it. They call it superstition. They call it myth. They insist no such book exists, and that the one in the university is a forgery, a curiosity mislabeled, a fraud bound in theatrics. Yet the chains remain, the locks remain, and the glass was cut thicker last year. No one dares touch it, not anymore. There were attempts, scholars who thought they might decipher its pages. They brought gloves, masks, lights. They planned weeks of study, but the notes they left were fragmentary. Ink bled on their fingers, words shifted when spoken aloud, phrases broke into murmurs not written, and more than one account ended mid-line, the pen dragging downward into silence. One journal lies unfinished on a shelf in the adjacent room. The last sentence trails into nothing. The paper is torn where the nib caught, as if the hand that wrote it had frozen in place, unable to finish what it began. The book has not been opened since, and still, students whisper of it. They tell each other stories, passed down from older years, that if you stand too close, the glass fogs with your breath, even when the room is cold, that if you listen carefully, you can hear not one hum, but many, layered voices, like a congregation, singing just below the threshold of hearing. The archivists deny it, but they do not deny the locks, or the chains, or the fact that once a professor fainted when he leaned too near. He woke with blood at his nose, and words he would not repeat, pressed between his teeth, and that's when he heard it, not in his ears, but in his thoughts, like a prayer he did not know, like a chant repeating itself without sound. He resigned within the week. Now the chamber is rarely entered. Lights are checked, locks inspected, glass polished from a distance. No one lingers, no one reads aloud, no one dares turn the first page. Yet questions remain. Why keep it at all? Why not destroy it, if it is only myth? Because it does not burn. That much is known. That much is recorded. The book has been to fire, and it endured. It drank in the smoke, and remained. And so it waits,
Visitors pass, they press their faces to the glass. Some laugh, some scoff, but when they step away, their laughter thins, their smiles grow uneasy, because later at night, they remember something. A weight in the air, a hum just at the edge of silence, a page that almost turned. The book waits still, bound, locked, sealed in glass and chain, but not forgotten, because once you have seen it, once you have stood in its presence, you cannot forget the sense that it is watching back, and the thought that one day, someone will dare. That one day, the glass will break, the chains will fall, the page will turn, and whatever waits in those words will not remain sealed forever. Faith is built on Scripture, but what if Scripture itself is corrupted? Some say the Black Bible is a relic of heresy, others an artifact never meant for human eyes. It remains locked away, waiting, not for fire, not for prayer, but for the hand that dares to open it.